Yeah, we're going to do something slightly different here as we start talking about GDPR. This is going to be a digital analog presentation. I'm the analog. That means I get to stand here in person. And coming in digitally, we've got Eve coming in from Seattle. It is sort of 4:30 in the morning, so we're ready to turn on the camera. Eve?
Hi, everybody. This is Eve. Well, you know, I don't consent to be seen quite yet. Give me just a moment here to get ready. It's actually 5:08 in the morning, so I hope you'll forgive me to just get ready for a moment here.
Well, actually, Eve's showing us exactly some of the basic principles around GDPR, in that it's probably not a good idea for us to just turn the camera on in her living room at 5 o'clock in the morning. And this is something that she probably needs control over. So when she's ready, hopefully we'll be able to turn the camera on. Eve, can you consent to the camera?
Yes, in the spirit of choice and control, yes, I now consent to be seen. Thank you.
Voila! Eve, welcome to Paris. Welcome your digital self to Paris.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Hi, Allan.
So we've been having a lot of discussions, as Robert says, around the issue of GDPR. And one of the things that has been frustrating me a little bit about GDPR is everybody seems to be talking about it like it's a prison sentence. Everybody is talking about it that it is these really onerous regulations that everybody's going to go to jail over. And I don't think that's what it is. And so even I was sort of talking about this, and one of the things about it that came up in our discussions was that the GDPR is really there to try and incentivize a new behavior. So Eve, I'm going to toss it off to you, and to start off with this, as to what are these new kinds of behaviors it's trying to incentivize? What do we see the GDPR trying to do?
Yes, indeed. So obviously a regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation, let's not kid ourselves, is trying to align incentives differently, more correctly, and make privacy a value, create proper incentives around value. So what are those? It's well known about the disincentives, the fines up to 4% of global turnover. We also know now that data subjects can make subject access requests around their own personal data that can be made for free now, instead of organizations being able to charge for that kind of subject access request. But there's an interesting viral structure that GDPR is now creating. So it's got a virality around it. There's a couple of ways in which this is true. For one, it's creating a kind of race to the top for organizations in dealing with other organizations. So you don't want to be kind of from the wrong side of the tracks if you're a data controller and you want to deal with a supply chain of other data processors, for example. So you've got organizations only wanting to deal with other organizations that are GDPR capable. There's another way in which GDPR is interestingly viral, and that is that it applies to any organization dealing with EU citizens, even if the organization isn't itself based in the EU. So those are some ways in which incentives are being aligned and raised, in a sense. Now, most importantly, GDPR is creating incentives around data subject, individual, ownership and control over their own personal data. So it's adding that individual, that's us, you and me, on days when we're not just going into work and doing what we can for the individuals that our organizations interact with. It's adding the individual to the transaction in very important ways. So one of the ways I want you to think about the General Data Protection Regulation is data protection, the phrase, is in the name of the regulation. And data protection is just another word, another way of saying data privacy. But data protection means, in just that phrase, if you just look at it, it kind of means protect data from getting out. So I think of this as kind of the protective crouch and saying, please don't let any data out. It's kind of the security aspect of data privacy. But if you look at the actual regulation, there is much, much more to it. And in this way, GDPR is actually extremely innovative. It's got elements not just of sheer protection to it. For example, the rules around breach notification within 72 hours of discovery of the breach, but it's also got two other aspects to it. So in addition to protection, it's got an aspect of transparency. For example, ensuring that data subjects know what you know about them and what you're going to do with the data that you want to collect about them. So it's not just protection, it's a two-way street. Thirdly, it's about control. It's giving data subjects, not just regulators, but data subjects, control over what they can do. So one of my favorite parts of GDPR is in Article 7. It's a very powerful right, the right to withdraw consent at any time. That's one example of the kind of control that GDPR gives. So protection, transparency, and control.
Okay. So interestingly that you use the term innovative when it comes up to GDPR, because that's probably not the word that we would expect when you're sitting around a table talking about the GDPR regulations. But I like the terms that you're actually bringing up there in terms of control and transparency. And I think that as the GDPR is trying to set a floor, right, one of the phrases that I use a lot is regulation is the lowest form of incentive. If all you are trying to do is meet the regulation in order to keep somebody, our C-level execs, out of jail, that's really the lowest level of incentive that we're trying to do. And the GDPR has to do this. It has to say, look, here's the legal minimum that you have to do in order to follow these behaviors. However, as Eve was saying, the discussion around it's really trying to incentivize new ways of thinking about data, users' data and the data that we collect. One of the sort of phrases that I've used about this is the issue of it's civilizing the internet. It's sort of taking the internet from the wild, wild west that we had, I don't know, 120, 130 years ago, where it was perfectly valid that if you had a disagreement with somebody, you would meet at high noon on the main street and stand back to back, and eventually the fastest person to draw their gun wins. And we now don't do that anymore. There's a new behavior that we have to settle these disputes. Exactly the same thing is happening as to how enterprises, many of us in here focusing around enterprises, how enterprises have to deal with our consumers' data. And it sort of comes down to some of the terms that Eve was using in there about respect and transparency. Right? So transparency is one that I really like. The idea behind transparency is that our users should know what's happening with their data. I sort of look at that as the phrase of tell them what you're going to do with their data, and then do what you said you were going to do. Don't surprise them. Don't do weird things with their data. If the user is going to come back and say, wow, I didn't know that was going to happen, something went wrong in that process. If the user can be part of that relationship, they can be part of that transparent relationship and know what that data is, it builds something that I think the GDPR is really building towards, and that is building of trust. Right? It's building a trust relationship between our users and the enterprise. If they trust us with their data, we can do a lot of things with it. If they don't trust us, well, then they're not going to give us data they don't want to be able to share with us. And so that issue of transparency and sort of leading us to a more civilized internet is, I think, the sort of goal that GDPR is trying to get to. Eve brought up another sort of comment in there as we start looking at how enterprises focus on this, and that is the user wants to have control. All of us, no matter what we are, want control over our lives, and we want control over our data. And so it doesn't actually matter what the service that we're offering is. If the end user feels that they can turn it on as they wish, and they can turn it off as they wish, they are in control of that. When you're in control of something, then your trust level goes up, and you start building up your trust. And so a lot of that is about giving control to the end user of the underlying process. The sort of pieces that we come up with, one of the phrase, we were actually arguing about this over dinner the other night, the issue of opt-in consent. So almost always we have opt-in consent. Somewhere there's a checkbox, and it says, would you like us to send you meaningless emails that you're not going to read? And you check, or most of us probably uncheck that box, because we don't want those emails. And somebody brought up this question at dinner. They said, who would ever check that checkbox? And so I started thinking about that and started looking at the issue of, well, when would we check that checkbox? And I can think of a few of them that I actually have. So one of my examples is that of my bank. My bank has an option that says to me, would you like to participate in paperless billing? We will send you your statements once a month via email. Well, golly gee, that's an email from my bank that I'm actually saying, yeah, that's a good idea. I'd like to get that. So there is an opt-in that actually makes sense. Another example is American Express. American Express says to me, if you'd like to opt in, we'll send a message to your phone every time your credit card is charged. Would you like us to do that? Yeah, please, go ahead and do that. I'd like to know when that's going to happen.
I'd like to give another example, and I think you heard already this morning from Amber Sports, and one of the things that our CTO's office team, of which I'm a member, works on quite a bit is the Internet of Things world. And when it comes to connected basketballs, connected fitness watches, connected clothes, the data coming off of smart devices and smart things that aren't even devices is so exciting regarding is the ability to do things with that data. I mean, the difference between a smart device and a dumb device is the data. And there are many positive use cases for people in sharing that data. That's why those devices kind of exist. And organizations and people alike are looking for opportunities to share that data, not necessarily in a social context, although there may be social use cases, but in a constrained sense. So there are many opportunities to give people choice and control in sharing that data, not necessarily even in an opt-in sense, but think of it in a share button sense. What in the healthcare world they would call consent directives. I think always of a Google Docs share button, which is, it's not a privacy setting, it is an ability for you to share at will with whomever you want, which may be an organization, in a way that meets your needs for the moment. You can always withdraw consent at any time, and that's a kind of consent too, and it is a kind of choice and control which is inherently empowered. And this is the world we live in now. This is the digitally transformed world. And IoT is a living example of it, and every electronic interaction should be enabled in the same way, and GDPR is kind of telling us to go there, and it's telling us how to go there.
And actually, that exact same thing, sort of to put it in another way, one of the ways that I think about that, the way that we should be thinking as enterprises of how to work with the end user's data is don't think in terms of doing things for the user. Think of doing things with the user. Right? So as Eve says, you've got devices, whether they are fitness devices or whatever these IoT devices is, as an end user, I want control over what's going to happen to that data. I want control to say, yes, I'd like you to send me a text message, or yes, I'd like it to go to this application. Don't decide that for me. Give me the choice to be able to say, yes, this is something that is valuable to me, because if I have that control, my trust level goes up, right? So
and especially, don't do things to the user. That's straight out. Don't do that.
Absolutely. It's with the user, not for the user or to the user. So some of the other things that we start looking at in terms of the behaviors that GDPR is trying to incent, right, when we're looking at things, is that we spoke about transparency. We spoke about being able to give users a picture of what we know about them, what data we are actually using of theirs. Unfortunately, that's not really our business. We're doing some other service, and that data is really just stuff that we have in a database or a directory or something like that. And it's difficult to present that information to the user, because one of the requirements, one of the rights in the GDPR is, well, two of the rights, I guess. One of them is for the end user to be able to see what data you have about them. And the other one is the right to fix it if it's wrong. That's not my phone number anymore. I'd like to fix that. Now, it doesn't say you have to have a page that they can go in and edit this information. It just says there needs to be a process that the user can fix false data about them. Right? And one of the challenges we have is that in most enterprises, we don't really have a good way to do that. That's not really what our business revolves around. And so, shameless plug for the GDPR dashboard, right? This is something that, by being able to present this information to the end user in one place, so that the end user knows that they can go and have a look. They can go and have a look at the My Account or whatever that might be and see the data that we have on them, see how that data is being used, and change it if it's wrong, gives them definitely a very strong sense of empowerment. It gives them an ownership over that data. And if they own that data and they can control that data, again, it comes back to building trust around that picture. See, I have to scroll my piece up about this. So one of the other terms that comes up in the GDPR, and it's one that we argue about quite a lot, is the right to be forgotten. Started a few years ago on a lawsuit that happened in Spain. So one of the challenges that we have in real life, we have data that has a finite lifetime. And at the end of that lifetime, it's expected that it's no longer referred to. Right? So we have things like criminal records. And at the end of especially juvenile records, when they turn 18, those records get sealed, and they are no longer referred to. Likewise, we have bankruptcies. It's a major issue to our consumer to declare bankruptcy. But at the end of 10 years, we have this contract with the consumer that says, after 10 years, if you have behaved yourself financially, your bankruptcy sort of falls off the end of your record. There's a finite life cycle to that. Digitally, Google never forgets. Right? Google remembers things, and there's no date on what Google remembers. And so what the GDPR is trying to give us from this perspective is to make us think about where there's data that has a finite lifetime, treat it like it's got a finite lifetime. Treat it to the point that when it's no longer meaningful, that we forget it, that we no longer refer to that. Likewise, from the user's perspective, I don't wish to have my account with you anymore. Forget who I am. I would like that removed from your system. Right? This is giving, again, the end user control over what their data is doing and how their data is actually being used. So, Eve, I sort of wanted to come back to you and talk a little bit around, as we've got sort of this mindset in place of respecting the user, respecting their data and working in partnership with the end user in terms of that data, are there some, obviously there are there some steps that we can go down and sort of ways that we can start looking at this?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a path to go on from compliance to trust. I mean, how can an organization become trustworthy and not just say to an end user, whether that is, you know, a consumer, customer, patient, citizen, whatever the role that that end user is in, it's easy to say, look, we're compliant, we've got a compliance checkbox. You want to do more than that, particularly where that end user has a choice in where they can go, because we see many examples of individuals being able to walk away from your digital service and choose another one. You don't want to be a headline. You know, I sort of track these headlines where services have made a potentially bad choice, and they invite an opening where individuals can go and go find a competitor. So I'll give a couple examples here in a moment. So I've identified 4 steps that you can take to go on that journey from compliance to trust. Number 1, identify where your digital transformation opportunities and user trust risks or gaps intersect. So a recent example that I noticed was where Mattel had a product that was a kind of a smart hub in the home that was meant for children, like babies to children. It went to market, and there were a number of concerns about privacy since it was monitoring children's every move, and that was how it was designed to work. As soon as it went onto the market, there was an outcry from privacy organizations and from parents, and it was pulled from the market. So obviously, there was a big intersection between that wonderful digital transformation opportunity and the user trust risk. And ideally, you want to identify that intersection before you go to market. That's a particularly expensive way to have a problem with that. Other times we've seen that is when Evernote changed their privacy policy and said, well, by the way, we're going to have humans looking at all of your notes to improve our service. And people said, you're going to what? We don't like that. So between something like December 14th of 2016 and December 16th of 2016, they decided to change their privacy policy, announce that, and then they didn't entirely change it back, but they changed it in a remarkable degree so as to have people not go to all their competitor services that store notes online. So that's step 1, is identify those intersections and consider carefully the opportunities and risks. And that's the start of your journey. Number 2, conceive of personal data as a joint asset between your organization as a data controller in that role and the data subject. Now, I say joint asset because, you know, GDPR has specific rules, obviously, about the roles of data subjects, data controllers, data processors. But what I'm trying to do with this step is say there are different stakeholder roles in an organization. Privacy professionals, risk leads, already are incentivized to look out for the role of data subjects. They do not necessarily, however, have the incentive structure to do things like A/B testing for how your upsell program is working, or how a marketing campaign will do, or how the loyalty program is working. Business owners do have those incentives. They do not, however, necessarily have the incentives to work on the side of the risk program. So stakeholders have to work together, and that's where seeing personal data in the light of a joint asset kind of co-created with an individual starts to put things in a different light. So it's a mindset shift. And the mindset shift is key for starting to become trustworthy because, as I said earlier, on another day, you're just a human being who wants to be treated with respect as well.
Actually, Eve, while you're on that one, the sort of interesting aspect around that is just because the data exists in your database doesn't mean it's your data. All that it means is you have it in your database because the user said you could do something specific with it. And
Right.
that's
So
what
you're
you
a
should be
custodian,
doing.
in
You are a
fact.
custodian of their data. It's not yours.
And to that point, step 3 is lean into consent. So let's talk about the 6 legal bases for data processing allowed in GDPR. Those 6 legal bases are to protect a person in the public interest, because you have a legal obligation, because you have a contractual obligation, because it's in the legitimate interests of the data controller, and consent. So, right. Now, it isn't always appropriate to choose consent, collecting consent of your data subject, but often it is. Now, as a data controller, somebody, an organization directly interacting with your data subject, quite often you're going to be choosing between legitimate interests of the controller and consent. And I heard a wonderful example of legitimate interests of the controller. Let's say you make pizzas and you deliver pizzas to the person who's going to eat the pizzas. Well, if you need to know the address so that you can deliver the pizzas, that's legitimate interests of the controller. You really need to know the address so you can take the pizza there. But in other cases of needing to know some personal data, well, a lot of strange motivations can be ascribed to legitimate interests of the business, and you'd better be really, really sure. Choosing to ask for consent when you don't really need to know the personal data is a very powerful thing to do. It allows you to enter into a trustworthiness kind of journey with an individual.
So before you move on, one of the phrases that I often use with that is when people say, do I need to ask consent to do whatever this is? My response to that is quite simply, would the data subject be surprised by what you're about to do?
Yes.
And if the answer is yes, then yeah, you probably need to ask for consent. Right? If you've asked them about this before and they'll say, yeah, that's perfectly fine, you probably don't. And your last one, Eve.
Last step is simply take advantage of identity and access management for building trust. As you mentioned earlier, GDPR is, it's meant to be technology neutral. It doesn't say build in an electronic self-service capability. However, it's extraordinarily powerful to have an identity-centric means of security and privacy. So taking a holistic view to remove friction from trust-building choices is an excellent way to go about it. So I just want to run down classic ways that you can use IAM to add these capabilities for protection, transparency, and control as we've been discussing them. So briefly, protection. What can you do with IAM for protection? Well, basic identity lifecycle management. Being able to gather all the silos of all of your application user management in one place. Being able to have secure personal data storage, that's a specialty function. And even having a solution for data residency, which you can do with fractional replication at the basic level of where you store your data. Now, as I said, data protection is something you do kind of more for the security end of data privacy. So let's call that giving yourself a C+ grade for building trust with an end user. What could you do if you build in elements of transparency, that two-way street with an end user? So at that point, you're building consent lifecycle management. You're enabling some knowledge for the user of when they consented to terms of service, elements of federated identity consent, social consent, consent to marketing preferences. As you were indicating, Allan, Do I actually want to get your newsletter? Well, I might want to get your newsletter, and there may be other more specialized functions. Well, what grade might an organization get? I would assign that organization a B-. Two-way street is nice. That's transparency. Now, what can we do if you actually offer choice and control? Now we're talking about user-directed sharing and approvals, going beyond opt-in, going into the element of user-managed access, UMA. Can I press a share button at will, not externally influenced consent? I get to say when and where and how much. Withdrawal and modification of consent at a fine grain. Do I have control from a single pane of glass, a la our profile and privacy management dashboard? Now we're talking a grade of A for building trustworthiness in that journey with the user. So that's what I mean by step 4 in this journey.
Okay, thank you, Eve. So wrapping things up, the basic thing from my perspective about the GDPR is the GDPR are a set of fairly fierce laws that are trying to change our behavior as enterprises to respect the user's data, make them part of the journey, and build trust relationships between us and our end users, and more importantly, between our end users and us. If you have that trust and you use their data in the appropriate contexts, right, then you pretty much end up being in compliance of the GDPR. So with that, thank you very much for being here, Eve. We're right at the end of our 32-odd minutes here. So thank you for virtually teleporting yourself to us in Paris.
It was a great pleasure. I hope you all have a great rest of your day at the summit. Take care, everybody.